Well, thank you everyone for coming today to the talk. We are very pleased today to have Professor Gita Steiner-Khamsi. Thank you, Professor Steiner-Khamsi, for being with us and taking the time to give this talk, which I was really looking forward to. Professor Gita Steiner-Khamsi is the William H. Kilpatrick Professor of Comparative Education at Teachers College, Columbia University in New York. She also holds an honorary appointment as UNESCO Chair of Comparative Education Policy at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva, in Switzerland. She is a past president of the Comparative and International Education Society, former editor of the World Yearbook of Education, and also served 5 years as the academic director of NORAG, which is based in Graduate Institute in Geneva. And Professor Steiner-Khamsi currently serves as a lead section editor of the Journal of Comparative Policy Analysis. She published widely on policy borrowing, policy transfer, and global diffusion of reforms in education in a wide range of journals, books, and book sections. So I would like to welcome Professor Steiner-Khamsi to give the talk today.
Thank you so much, Mubarak. And what a great idea to do this webinar series. And I'm a bit humbled because I see a lot of very accomplished colleagues and scholars here. So I'm glad we're having a discussion so they can correct me whatever I say that might not be quite accurate. So I keep it short. I keep it to 30 minutes max, even less. And Mubarak, feel free to interrupt me when I'm getting off on a tangent. Let me pull up the PowerPoint and so I'm talking about citizen engagement and social accountability. It's also called CISA. And this is actually a new line of work that the World Bank, but also OECD is pursuing. And it seems like a new thing, but the question is it really that new? So I'm trying to find out here. And I think, let me just turn off my email. Can you hear my email coming in also? Oh, okay, so it's only me, okay. And something caught my attention, and probably you all saw that also. In early January, Meta, just shortly before the inauguration, Meta announced that it would stop fact-checking. Do you remember this? And everyone was like really shocked how this came, and they talked about how it was politically skewed, Zuckerberg, etc. And so what they really did is replace fact-checking in Meta or in Facebook with user comments. And they followed this line on users should correct rather than someone above or someone in the hierarchy. Users should correct, they should give feedback. They followed the same argument that a couple of years before, I think 1 or 2 years before, X did or Twitter did. So they moved in, X in particular, moved from fact-checking to community notes. And as you know, it was very controversial because it meant anyone could do vile stuff, it is the post-truth era, and this is like an epitome of the post-truth era where anyone can claim whatever they want. And actually, Chris Lubinsky, who is here, whose work I respect highly, talked about information silos, but also information pollution. So this is our era of information pollution where users correct rather than someone from the organization. And the question is, what's the equivalent in the governance space? And in the governance space, we also, and this is my point here today, we have moved obviously from monitoring standards that the state establishes to social accountability. So today, the whole talk will be about how that move towards social accountability or demand-side accountability or user side accountability, how that emerged. And we would like to look at some of the historical antecedents. So concretely, just to finish that, anecdote about the tech sector, they established rules. Basically, anyone can correct notes. It's a little bit like the Wikipedia method procedure. Anyone can correct. Anyone's knowledge counts, and it's an endless feedback loop. So the next user can correct again, and there is a rating system in the community notes whether they found what the previous person corrected, and you see that how to rate the community note. There's a rating system to get feedback on how valuable that was. So it was actually, when you look at it, it's highly democratic, but it depends who will be activated and mobilized to do those community notes. So we should expect a lot of community mobilization to crowd that space on the internet with their knowledge. And this in and of itself will become a very interesting topic in knowledge brokerage. And again, scholars like Chris Lewinsky are the kind of scholars that look into that. So let me talk about these three things. So this was the anecdote to show you that CISA has really arrived in the tech sector, but I want to show you that it also has an equivalent in governance. And I would like to talk about CISA itself, citizen engagement and social accountability, and then go into sequential analysis of CISA in the context of public administration reform, and finally show how it has been translated or is being translated as we speak into the education sector. So CISA, what is it? The early beginnings, and actually he is in public administration, so maybe colleagues in education don't know him that well, but Osmani Porto de Oliveira wrote early on the global diffusion of participatory budgeting. It's called PB in finance or public administration. It started in Porto Alegre in Brazil in 1989, and it's simple. It is citizen holding the government accountable by having public fora, public meetings in which they discuss the budget, where the budget is shared openly and feedback is solicited at the stage before it is being approved and put into action. This model, it was a Brazilian model actually, but the World Bank picked it up and other IOs and diffused it globally because it fit exactly into that new line of moving away from the state supervising to giving it into the hands of citizens and to provide feedback to the government. Similarly, in the education sector, Brent Edwards wrote, I think that was his dissertation actually, already in the 1990s, shortly after the millennium, about Educo. It started in El Salvador, and again, the World Bank picked it up and disseminated globally. And the idea was to have parent association and organizations involved at the school level and basically keep an eye on the principal, but also participate in school development. And, I could go into a lot of detail, and maybe we have time. All the IOs are now supporting that, not just the World Bank. The idea, and they do it in different ways, grants for school programs. They try to, they usually always require school boards to supervise where the money is going. They require school development plans. Very often in many countries, the school boards are just on paper. They don't really work. They don't really dare to contradict the principle, but it has become also a reform that diffused globally and was scaled up globally. So we have early initiatives, and that started in some place in El Salvador and or in Brazil in this case, and then went global with the help of IOs. And we know from international relations IOs legitimize reforms. And by legitimizing reforms of a country, they help to speed it up. And they speed it up, especially if we have benchmarking, especially if we have SDGs or before that Millennium Development Goals, etc. So that's also an interesting phenomenon that I'm not going to go into detail here. But so there are antecedents to CISA or citizen engagement, but it has now become part of a strategy over the last 2 years, and almost like a conditionality for World Bank operations to have citizen engagement. Coming from the World Bank, the first reaction is disbelief. How can the World Bank, who's a bank, really promote, democracy and citizen engagement? And just let me tell you, it sounds better than the reason why they do it, it's not so much for democracy and for openness, but it is a matter of monitoring and control. It is a shifting from state to citizen. And this is more the reason why this is happening. And with everything that IOs do these days, they also have indicators to measure progress towards their reform objectives. So now we have the GovTech Maturity Index, GTMI, and there are many, many indicators measuring that. I want to draw there's like a core government systems index, public service delivery index. I think the third composite index is interesting. It has 12 indicators. It's called the Digital Citizen Engagement Index, and then the GovTech Enable Index. So the DCEI, the Digital Citizen Engagement Index, has 12 indicators, and it measures citizen feedback mechanism, open data, open government portals, etc. So this is pretty new. It is from 2022. So let's again, how did we get there? There's a lot of scholarship in public policy, and especially the French colleagues from Sciences Po, Patrick Le Gallet and Lacombe, they talk about whenever you have a change in policy instrument, you also have a change in what the role of the state is. So when we move from standards accountability in the 2000s to public or social accountability right now, that means that the role of the state has also changed. And there are different terms we can use, but we can also say we used to have supply side accountability where the government would establish standards and also establish how those standards would be measured. And we all know, like the 21st century curriculum frameworks or we look back to 2 or 3 decades of standardization of national curriculum and standardization of tests that measure whether students really learned what they were supposed to learn. And we moved, and already in the 2000s, the way the state would monitor or regulate was by assessing compliance with those standards. So it wasn't the bureaucratic Weberian state where we had micromanagement, where it was compliance with laws, but it was more compliance with state-mandated standards. And in my new book that will come out in a month, I talk about the interventionist state, and many other colleagues wrote about it. This was the era of governance by numbers, the interventionist state that establishes first standards and then measures whether those standards are met. And it's actually post-NPM already, 2000, because NPM was about market accountability, but this was the interventionist state. So what we now experiencing right now is a move. There's a really great book that Paola Mattei wrote from Milan about the engaged state. And this is a form of destatization. So again, sometimes things sound better than they are. It's a form of anti-state or destatization. I think that's a term that Stephen Ball created in one of the articles, the destatization. I'm not sure I'm spelling it correctly, but it's the hollow state, the state that delegated to the private sector, the state that does public-private partnership, the state that outsources and is minimally involved. And as part of this move from the interventionist state to the engaged state, it started to emphasize, the government started to emphasize demand-side accountability, or CISA, citizenship engagement and social accountability. And here, and that's where, you know, Mubarak's important work comes in on database regulation and the importance of EMIS. And one of the great pieces that Professor Hossein wrote was about how the World Bank repurposed EMIS over several decades, but every time it actually expanded education, management, and information system, or EMIS we call it. So what became important is the feedback systems have to be in place and to empower citizens and users to look over the shoulders of the state. In other words, all the government needs to do, and that's not small, it needs to make data available, and a lot of data. And that in and of itself, that's the expectation, will create demand-side accountability, because everyone is able to look into the data and hold the government accountable. When we look back at how this is the old, now it has a very unpleasant name, NATO. Christopher Hood wrote about the 4 tools of government, and he, you know, N stands for node, A for, I think, maybe accountability, I'm not sure what, but T stands for treasure. But this is a, you know, classic theory of public administration. At that time, Hood wrote about 4 tools of government, and that's the title of his book, 4 Tools of Government, which is governance by legislation. And this is what is the common sense about how our governments rule. But then also governments by persuasion. During COVID-19, this was a way to regulate. The third one is governance by incentives, which is very popular in US higher education. You give a grant but also private foundations do that. They provide a grant and try and direct thinking and action in the direction of the grant objectives, but also governance by contracts. And this is now under siege in the Trump administration, when, you know, the threat of stop federal funding if DEI and other things that are against this current administration are enforced. So these are the 4 classical way of how governments regulate. But the new one that only started at the end of NPM and towards the interventionist state was governance by numbers. And, you know, if you're in education or in the health sector, you maybe know the big No and Poll project that was around the millennium. That's where that term governance by numbers came from. Jenny Oska was there, Soteria Gregg, Christian Marois, Eric Manger, Agnes van Zaan, all these big sociologists of education, they were in that project involved, and they already noticed around 2000 that the government is moving away from direct supervision to delegation to users. And it does it by having numbers made available and standards enforced and then measured in terms of those standards. So this is just quickly, I don't want to lose too much time, but basically the 5th one is new. The 5th one, performance indicators, standards-based practices, is a new one. I think Mubarak will make those slides available so you can look into detail, but this is from Le Gallet. Now let's talk about how it is translated in the education sector. My colleague Tony Verger created that term, the Barcelona group SAVA, School Autonomy with Accountability. And I tried in my own work and in the book that's coming out in a month to show that there were 2 reform ways. First, it was market-based accountability, like the Milton Friedman model. And then it moved once, all the inequality surfaced and all the erosion of quality, the state became active again. So it was a re-centralization of the state. But it started with in New Zealand, Australia, it moved to the UK, and then it went to the US. And once it was in the US, at that time, it was like a transatlantic transfer. The US was referring to the UK, the UK was referring to the US in terms of school choice, and so it was like a circular transfer. But this is, a good example of studying global diffusion of a school reform, and that's what I'm using in my own work. And I don't want to go into details here again. I'm trying to make the point in my own writing that it was not just one reform, there were two reform waves. It started with school autonomy, with all these kind of policies that are part of school autonomy. In countries that never had school managers, we started to see school managers being trained in finance and in management. So there was this professionalization of school management because we moved at that time towards school-based or site-based management. Again, it was empowering the school level by having them develop school development plans and profiles. School boards, as I said, more on paper than in practice. But these were all part of the change mechanism. And the idea was that if you give school choice, if you have school-based management, if you have per capita financing, then schools will do better, just because the money is based on the number of students rather than what we used to call incremental budgeting, which means that schools get money regardless of the number of students, but based on their expenses and last year's budget. So the move to per capita financing, which I think Tony Verja does not acknowledge enough, was actually a really big part of the school choice and school-based management, because the funding formula changed, and the World Bank, wherever it was, and OECD, wherever they were, they really enforced also per capita financing. That means that it's per student. And then later on, with the deterioration of quality and inequity, the whole standardization started. And that was around 2000. And actually, it was not a conservative move, but it was under Blair, it was under Clinton, it was in Germany under Schroeder. So they moved away from rampant privatization, which was in the first phase, to controlled choice and to public-private partnership. It was still centrist, but it was not centrist right, but it was centrist a little bit left, because the idea was to bring back the state and make the state develop standardized curriculum, standardized tests. And as much as we hate tests and the standardization and the proliferation of tests, the standardization of tests, and that's my argument, was a reaction to the disastrous market accountability that we had before. Again, let me just skip this, but I have great respect for the work of the Stanford group and Toronto group, Patricia Bromley and Ria Kijima and their doctoral students and master students. They collected policy documents from all over the world. They collected it at the global level from OECD, World Bank, UNESCO, UNICEF, and found that reform frequency or a reform bubble between 1990 and 2007. And when you go into detail, you see that this was really the neoliberal era where a lot of things were happening worldwide, not just in the Anglophone countries that we typically know and write about. So they identify that as the neoliberal era. So the neoliberal era ended actually in 2008. And that's why it's sometimes ridiculous when people still talk about NPM and new public management, because we have moved on to new eras. And this is what I'm trying to show in a sequence, and we have in the historical institutionalists such as Pearson, but also Abbott. They do a lot of sequence analysis, and I got inspired by their work, and I tried to adopt it to public administration reform and to education reform. So when we look back in a sequence, you have here new public management, and it is the characteristics of every reform, that every reform justifies itself by putting the previous reform down, by saying how they are better than the previous reform and what they are resolving what the previous reform did not. So the argument of the NPM at the time was that they are much more consumer friendly, they are less rigid, they are less fixated on procedures. So they moved away from input regulation to output regulation. So basically anyone could provide schools in that logic of the 1980s and 90s, not just the state, but also private providers. After the disaster happened during that market-based accountability, the interventionist state came in, re-centralized, and the focus was not anymore on outputs or outputs were defined by whether the services were provided or not. It wasn't about whether the services were good or bad. Outcomes means impact and also is a measurement of quality. So the interventionist state started to establish standards and quality assurance mechanism and moved away from that rampant market-based accountability. And every time the objectives of data collection really changed. So in education, for instance, the idea was also to introduce performance-based bonuses and salary system, a reform that did not stick in many countries because teacher unions, for good reasons, were opposing it. But the idea was to move from outputs to outcomes. And in the last iteration and the last reform that we have, the last reform sails under e-government, sometimes digital government, sometimes the name new public governance. This is where CISA comes in, and social or public accountability. And the type of regulation is, if you think it to the end, it's not necessarily tests and outcomes measurement, but it is feedback systems, it's public opinion, it is user feedback. And the object of data collection is actually the student, and the OECD move and the World Bank, it's all about enhancing the resilience and employability of students. That's where also CEL comes in and others that are very much granular, or some, Christian Edison from now Zurich and Paolo Mattei, they talk about the affective turn, or the, I think, neuroscience turn in governance. So in the education sector, we have, so CISA is World Bank, but with also translation education, but the OECD also, the two movers that started the whole neoliberal, era in the IOs, the OECD and World Bank, they now both move into this e-government or digital government or new governance mode. And the OECD talks about, in the Learning Compass 2030, about creating new value, reconciling tensions and dilemmas, and that's the important one, taking responsibility. And of course, OECD sees it in their own, it's a path dependency. They see it building on what they had, the most important OECD reform that we all know in education is the 2003, the DESECO reform. And I see Saija is here, Volmari from Finland, especially in the Nordic region, the DESECO was the beginning actually of competency-based school curriculum. And PISA became the instrument to measure basically whether the DESECO was implemented correctly or not. That's the way I see PISA. But So for OECD, this is a logical next step after the SECO. And they see the move towards the student. And it's part of a bigger discussion that is happening in the OECD, the group, and I think the Nordic countries have been very actively involved, pushing for that, including Iceland, to see development beyond GDP, beyond economic growth. So there's a whole movement within OECD, and they pushed for a well-being framework rather than one that narrowly defines development as economic growth. And as part of this movement, the well-being framework that is part of the 2030 Learning Compass, it's not just about human and economic capital, but it's also about environmental resources, teaching and social resources, and then, of course, as before, economic resources. So environment became a big issue, but also social responsibility, social cohesion, all these things have become important objectives of the OECD Learning Compass. So what we have here as an example, social accountability and feedback at the center of this new framework that the World Bank and OECD are using. And it shows there are different developments that we see, the move towards more and more home-based testing of learning outcomes. The testing industry has become huge. It's not just that schools are using more and more standardized testing. Parents themselves and children and youth, they download apps. It has become something where the individual and the student is at the center, not just the school testing students. And we also see more and more parental involvement globally. And there are many factors that we can discuss. Some of it is the education of parents, of course, not just the change in governance and policies. But then also we see how this all generates parental pressure on school improvement. And I think that phenomenon is not discussed sufficiently. And parental pressure on school improvement is in education social accountability. That's what it means. It means that parents more and more put pressure on school improvement, and that's like a direct feedback system. So there is a lot of pressure on schools to publicize their data on learning on outcomes, and parents use it for, parent groups use it, and some parents group, of course, and others not, use it to generate reform pressure on schools. So this is it. Let's open up for discussion. This is, some of it will come in this book that will be open access book in a month or so. And I look forward to the discussion.